Okay. Now, before I formally begin, I do have a few administrative notes. Can you hear me all the way in the back? Excellent. First, I did my best to make the various documents that are obviously quite old legible on the screen. However, some may still be difficult to make out. At the conclusion of the presentation, you can view these documents in the back corner in the binder that we've put together. Second, everything I discussed today is unclassified. I actually enjoy living with my wife and would like to continue to do so. So everything in the presentation can be linked to an open source, and you will see some of the documents that still have classification markings on them. But each of these documents have been declassified by appropriate declassification authorities. I'll gladly answer any questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Finally, if this goes well, as Teresa said, I'm Andy Jones. If it doesn't, walk out of here knowing it was Randy Smith. So let me begin by thanking the Barnes-Deinzer Seneca County Museum Foundation and Teresa, our amazing director, for providing me this opportunity. I would also like to thank all of you for being here as well. I honestly did not expect this big of a turnout. Most importantly, I want to recognize our guests of honor, Ann and Mark Cramer here in the front, and Mark's wife, Lori, as well as the rest of the Cramer and Baumgartner family and friends. Now, we're here this afternoon to discuss the fascinating service and life of their dad, Ann and Mark's dad, a Seneca County and Tiffin, Ohio native, Marion Cramer. He's quite a dashing-looking fellow. Looks like he could have been pulled from Central Casting of An Officer and a Gentleman, except he really was one. But how did Marion come to our attention? Teresa already alluded to it somewhat, but sometimes either because of serendipity, cosmic forces, or some higher power that seems to align things at just the right moment, they occur. You see, I spent 24 years active duty in the Navy after enlisting right down the road here at the recruiting office when it used to be by Fort Ball Pizza. I also happened to run into the Navy recruiter while I was bagging groceries at the Kroger, and he reeled me in. So I retired in 2012 as a Master Chief Intelligence Specialist, and then spent another 9 years as a Navy civilian intelligence and cryptologic instructor, training and deploying sailors on operational intelligence and indications and warnings. Something I can relate to with Lieutenant Cramer. My wife and I moved back to this area in 2021, and I began volunteering here at the museum. Being the volunteer with military experience, Teresa designated me the military expert. So sometimes you just have to show up and you can become the expert. But that was fine with me because for such a small county, Seneca County residents have served this country in great numbers, in both war and peace. So this has given me a chance to tell some of their stories, and some of them you can see over here, including Lieutenant Cramer. So just about a year ago, Teresa, the director, returned from the conference in Columbus and said, "Andy, I met this interesting lady, Ann, at the conference, and her dad was in the Navy during World War II, but she and her brother, Mark, don't know a lot about what he did, as he never discussed it. I told her you may be able to help. Does this letter mean anything to you?" And so she showed me this on her phone. Now, it wasn't blacked out. I actually blacked it out because if my pointer will cooperate or not, there we go. And there we go. My eyes immediately went to the two highlighted areas. And that's what my eyes locked in on. And so I was immediately aware that was Thomas Dyer. Now, I'm willing to bet that unless you're a pretty avid World War II and Navy history buff, most people would be like, so what? But I was like, oh my gosh, he worked at Station Hypo and worked for Tom Dyer. And probably Joe Rochefort. I'll explain those folks in a little bit here. Yes, tell me more. And so the journey began. Now, the one section of the letter I haven't blacked out states, I know that you regret, as I do, that for security reasons, you are unable to explain with pride to your family and friends the exact nature of your duties and how important they were in the successful prosecution of the war, unquote. This explains why Marion never talked much about his service during World War II. He wasn't allowed. But he did leave a few clues behind that Mark and Ann found, and Ann was able to obtain her dad's officer service record. So we've been able to piece together some things. And of course, I was particularly interested in Marion from good old Tiffin, Ohio, as he was one of the early pioneers of the naval intelligence and cryptology fields, something I spent 33 years doing. So guys like me stand on the shoulders of men and women like Marion, who laid the groundwork in World War II for what we can do today. But before we get to his service, let's start at the beginning. So, Marion was born on June 7th, 1914, along with his fraternal twin, Mary Alice, in Tiffin, Ohio, to Fred and Clara Cramer. Mary Alice was older by a couple of minutes, and they would joke that she shoved him out of the way so she could be first. They also had two older brothers, Fred Jr. and Lewis, and a younger sister, Clara Lewis. Their father, a successful businessman, owned a washboard company and then the Monarch Toy Manufacturing Company here in Tiffin. Marion grew up at 42 Ohio Avenue, and the house still stands. He was raised Catholic and attended St. Joseph Grammar School, followed by Calvert High School, graduating in the class of 1932. After high school, Marion was accepted to Ohio State. Now, the top photo is of the entire Cramer family, and the bottom two photographs are of Marion and his twin sister, Alice. I believe the one there to the right is their first communion, right? Right over there. So, can you find Marion? I won't actually call on anybody, but there he is, right there. And this is from 5th grade at the St. Joseph Grammar School. Oh, what's that? Here we go. On this slide, you can see another family portrait of the Cramers taken in 1918. There's his high school graduation picture. That's a photo of Mary Alice and their mom, Clara. And I love this photo because this is a photo of two somewhat disgruntled teens, Mary Alice and Marion. And at least this is proof that even 100 years ago, teens weren't keen on being photographed. Because if you just look at that photo on their faces, it's like, oh gosh, hurry up and get this photo over with. This is the 1932 Calvertina yearbook with Marion and his high school photo and activities. Marion was a very good singer and would also later sing in the church choir after the war with his daughter Ann. Up at the top, you'll see this guy here, Bummy, Bernard Bumgardner. He and Marion were good buddies. And remember this fellow too, because he comes up again a little later. So, Ohio State. So Marion attended Ohio State from 1937, earning a bachelor's in business administration with a 2.1 GPA. At the time he attended Ohio State, it was required that all able-bodied men complete 2 years of military science courses. Now, this was due to the 1862 Morrill Act, or Land Grant College Act, signed by President Lincoln, that enabled the state of Ohio to build an institution of higher learning to train young men in agricultural studies, mechanical arts, and military tactics. When Marion attended, he was issued a cadet uniform and completed his required training his freshman and sophomore years. He did very well in military science courses, earning all A's. And if anyone knows anything about the military, they don't hand out A's. But he chose not to continue doing so his junior and senior year. It was optional to do it all 4 years. So following graduation, he was hired by Anchor Hockey Corporation and would work there until World War II. Now, unfortunately, I know that you can't read this, but this is one of the pages from the Ohio State University's 1933 course book that Ohio State was sent to me electronically. And it lists the courses that he possibly took. And as I stated on the previous slide, when Marion attended, it was required to complete 2 years. But you had a choice. There was 3 lines of training you could study, either infantry, field artillery, or the signal corps, which according to the 33 course description was student's choice. Now, although his transcripts aren't clear, I couldn't line up courses with course names completely. I theorize that based upon what he ended up and did in the war, he probably took the signal corps courses while he was at Ohio State. So, as I said, he graduated in 1937. In 1939, we all know that that's when Germany invaded Poland, and so the war was heating up. And that's when the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 was enacted on September 16th. And it's sometimes referred to as the Burke-Wadsworth Act. And this was the first such act of conscription in the United States during a time of peace. It was not, however, the first time conscription was used in America. It occurred in 1861 during the Civil War, and then once again in 1917 during World War I. However, during the 1930s, members of the U.S. government became concerned over the aggression being displayed by Italy, Japan, and especially Germany. So they enacted this act. The new law required all male United States citizens between 21 and 35 to register for the draft. Individual names were drawn through a lottery system, and if you were called to duty, the time of your service would be 1 year, and drafted soldiers would reside only in the U.S. territories or possessions. And it was limited to 900,000. However, the first draft under the new act was held in October of 1940. Midway through 1941, though, a bill narrowly passed extending the tour of duty for these draftees. And this quick and unexpected addition to their time of service did not fare well with many of the new inductees. However, this issue was short-lived because after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, attitudes changed, and thousands of men and women alike volunteered to defend America. Many more were drafted. With the onset of the Second World War, changes were made to the act calling for the registration of all men between the ages of 18 and 65 and 18 to 45 were liable for immediate induction and would be liable to serve until 6 months after the war's end. In the 7-year time frame from 1940 to 1947, over 10 million men were inducted under the act. And you can see the number of the military service strength there throughout the war. And unfortunately, as of 2021, there's less than 240,000 of our World War II veterans still with us. So this is Marion's draft registration card. He registered on 16 October 1940 in Lancaster, Ohio, in accordance with the Act. Well, it went too far. And you can see, what does this Y3CV4 mean? That was the question. So the United States was finally drawn into World War II on December 7th, 1941, when the Imperial Japanese Navy conducted a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor Naval Station, killing 2,403 and wounding 3,581, sinking and damaging 19 ships. The military wasted no time, and Marion received his draft notice in the upper right here. That's his draft notice the week prior to Christmas, and he was ordered to report on January 6, 1942. However, this letter here gave him permission to enlist in the Navy instead. And then here, this shows his a newspaper clipping from the Advertiser showing he stopped here in Tiffin before shipping out. And then here is his recruit identification card, the front and then the back with his fingerprint. And this is the big question for you all. What does Y3CV4 mean? And now, let's get that right there. All right. I lost my place already. Okay, so quite often men with Marion's background or a college degree, some military science and tactic courses, not to mention his age and experience, would have been immediately considered for an officer commission. But for some reason, Marion wanted to be in the Signal Corps or cryptanalysis field, back then called communications intelligence. This could have been because he possibly studied the Signal Corps at Ohio State, as I mentioned earlier, or possibly a former instructor or fellow student told him to consider it. There may not have been a way for him to become a communications officer immediately upon entry, so the Navy could have recommended he enter enlisted as a yeoman, which is what that Y3C stands for. He was a yeoman third class, and because of his college degree, he was brought in at a higher rank of pay grade. The V4 designation is indicated an intelligence specialty, so he is a yeoman, but with intelligence background capability. Then apply for a commission is what we thought he would do. This page just shows from the Navy manual in the 1937 what the requirements were to be a yeoman, and it's understanding Navy correspondence and being able to type so many words per minute. And what it doesn't go into, and it's even vague here, is what does a yeoman naval intelligence person do? And again, that's just left undetermined. But I have a few ideas I'll get to in a minute. These letters seem to imply Marion and a few others were either recruited for intelligence or requested the field. I'm not quite sure how that occurred. He may have taken a test equivalent to what we now call the ASVAB that showed he had the appropriate aptitude for intelligence work. Anne did tell me her dad was always good at math and could complete math formulas and problems in his head. And this is very beneficial if you're doing cryptanalysis or intelligence work. Oh, there. Marion's first assignment was in Washington, D.C. to the Office of Chief of Naval Operations, OPNAV, 20th Division of the Office of Naval Communications, the G Section, Communications Security. You'll see it shortened to OP-20G. We are not in possession of his enlisted service record, so I'm not sure if he even went to boot camp, and I'll show you why in a few moments. And his first commanding officer was John Redmond, who had served in the Navy for 39 years, retiring in October of 57 and promoted to Vice Admiral. He was one of the early cryptologic officers. Here are some various photos of Marion in his enlisted yeoman third class Navy uniform, which is also over here in the display case. Agnes was his sweetheart, and Liz and Ruth were Agnes's sisters. As a matter of fact, Agnes's sister Ruth, here in the center, would go on to enlist in the Navy Waves program. Women accepted for volunteer emergency service on July 26, 1944, and served until March 10, 1946. And so she was also in many ways a pioneer because it wasn't normal for women to do such manly type operations. But they did a lot of very good work during the war, and some of them even served in the cryptanalysis field. Okay, so these cards are one of the big clues that really kind of made me realize what he was doing. They cover a 7-month period from February to September of 1942, and each are for an individual month. I think he lost his August card because it's not in this collection. But because of the secret nature of the work conducted by personnel and communications intelligence, these special passes were required for access to these areas during non-regular work hours. And Marion was quite possibly on some type of a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week watch rotation, which would have required working after normal business hours. Because his first card up here is dated, this one here is dated February 9th, 1942, just 2 days after enlisting, leads me to believe he did not attend any type of formal boot camp or recruit training. This may be because he had the 2 years of military training and courses while attending Ohio State, even if it was Army-centric. Unfortunately, we do not know the type of work Marion performed. It is quite possible he began by typing reports and messages based on what was being collected and intercepted in the analysis of Japanese communications, but he also could have been doing actual cryptanalysis or intelligence roles. Back then, the Navy didn't have cryptologic technicians, so yeomen, radio technicians, or even some band members were taught cryptanalysis skills. So he could have been doing that. So I'm talking about all this intelligence and cryptology terms and everything, so just to give everybody kind of what it all means. Military intelligence is the disciplined process of collecting, interpreting, analyzing, and disseminating information to support the decision-making process of commanders in combat. Cryptology is the science concerned with data communication and storage in secure and usually secret form. It encompasses both cryptography and cryptanalysis. Cryptography, you could say, is the defense side of cryptology. It's the study of principles and techniques by which information could be concealed in ciphers and later revealed by legitimate users employing the secret key. So Navy ship here sends a message to Navy ship over there, but when it goes out, it's encrypted. It gets to the other ship. They've got the same key. It's unencrypted. The guys on that ship can read it. But the Japanese, if they intercepted that, would have to do cryptanalysis. And that's the offensive side of cryptology. That's the science and art of recovering or forging cryptographically secured information without knowledge of the key. And that's what all of these people we're talking about were doing during World War II. They were intercepting the Japanese Navy's communications and then trying to figure out through cryptanalysis what they were actually saying back and forth to one another. Comment or communications intelligence is just a subcategory of signals intelligence that engages in dealing with messages or voice information derived from the interception of foreign communications. And then you have some security classifications. During World War II, it was these three. It was restricted, confidential, and secret, with restricted being the least secure, the least classified type of information. After the war, the entire government dropped restricted and we incorporated top secret. Now, there was another element within this that's called code word. So the Enigma, which you may have heard of, was the German communication system. The British were heavily involved in doing cryptanalysis on that with our help, but that was called Ultra. It had a code word Ultra. While the JN-25, the Japanese communication system, fell under the code name of Magic. And so if they sent out a message, it would be secret magic afterwards. And that would let people know that only a few select people could view that message because of the sensitive nature. We didn't want the Japanese to know that we were reading some of their traffic because then they would have changed the keys. So that's why Marion was in a very, very select group of people who had access to that. Now, a little bit of intel history. There's an old saying, Intelligence is the world's second oldest profession, but with fewer scruples. Yes, the oldest being prostitution. So although spies and intelligence work was used to some degree in the Revolution, War of 1812, and Civil War, the United States did not have any permanent intelligence units or commands until 1882, when the Navy established the Office of Naval Intelligence to collect intelligence on foreign navies in peacetime and in war. 3 years later, a similar organization, the Military Intelligence Division, was created within the Army to collect foreign and domestic military data for the War Department and the Army. As America inched closer to entering World War I, President Wilson had a general disdain for spies and intelligence, but changed his mind after working with the British Intelligence Service. In June of 1917, the first U.S. Signals Intelligence Agency was formed within the Army, known as MI-8. The agency was charged with decoding military communications and providing codes for use by the U.S. military. After World War II, it was transferred to the State Department. Although they had successes, President Hoover decided that the State Department's interception of diplomatic cables and correspondence could not be tolerated, apparently agreeing with the alleged yet oft-quoted statement by Secretary of State Henry Stimson, "Gentlemen, do not read each other's mail." So they essentially stopped. However, in 1924, the Navy established a communications intelligence section under the Office of Naval Intelligence with the cover title Research Desk. Lieutenant Lawrence Safford was the first officer to lead the organization and is considered the father of Navy cryptology. Mrs. Agnes Driscoll, another Ohio native who went to Ohio State and was a World War I Navy yeomanette-in-chief, became their civilian cryptanalysis with the Navy and the NSA until 1959 and is considered the first lady of Navy cryptology. Lieutenant Stafford and Driscoll trained and mentored a number of important naval cryptologists and intelligence officers, including Joe Rochefort, Thomas Dyer, Ed Layton, and Joseph Wagner, all who Marion probably worked with and he did work for a couple of them. As I mentioned earlier, Tom Dyer gave him that letter saying, "Don't talk about this." So during the late 20s and 30s, these early cryptologists developed the methods and acquired machinery to aid in cryptanalysis and even broke some Japanese diplomatic codes such as the Red Book and Purple Book prior to World War II. But in late 1939, the Communications Intel team attacked the new Japanese General Purpose Fleet Code, commonly referred to as JN-25. That complicated code, it replaced the Blue Book the Japanese had used for the most secret and high-level Navy communiques. Driscoll successfully solved some of the ciphered component of the five-number system, as JN-25 was then called, that allowed recovery of the code's values, a system of more than 30,000 five-number groups that were used as substitute for words. And I'll show you a picture of it here a little later. And then these numbers were enciphered, so it was quite the process that they had to go through. But because of their early work, all of these folks, and then when Marion joined them, were able to have a better idea of what the Japanese intentions were after Pearl Harbor. So after spending about 7 months as an enlisted guy, Marion submitted his officer application. And this is what it looked like. It was 4 pages, and he submitted it on December 24th, 1942. What's very strange is he had originally applied for the Supply Corps, and I don't know whether he did that by accident or if maybe the officers helping him said, "Hey, you'll be better selected if you do Supply Corps, and then we'll get you switched over later." But that's possibly what he did. And then over here, because you're applying for officer, you had to put references. What I found interesting is one of the references on here was Judge Ralph Sugru, who was a judge here in Tiffin. But what else does that have to do with anything? Well, Ralph Sugrue is the brother of Fanny Sugrue, who happened to be the wife of Major General Lorenzo Dow, another Seneca County native son, who at the time, during World War II, was recalled to active duty and serving in Washington, D.C. as well. So Marion had friends in high places. These are some of the letters. When he was applying, letters of recommendation are always important in getting accepted. And he obviously made a very good impression at Anchor Hocking, because not only his supervisor, but the vice president of the company wrote him some very glowing recommendations. Of course, boys will be boys. I know you can't read this, but it's back there, and it's very funny. One of Marion's buddies was having fun at his expense and sent him this letter of recommendation. I particularly like the last paragraph because it says, "Brevity is the soul of wit. So remember, if you take this wastrel, profligate, dissipated, indecent, immoral, and intemperate person, I can only say you'll be sorry." So someone was having fun at his expense. So nothing like a buddy to keep you grounded. So his application for a commission was accepted, and he was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Naval Reserve on 31 March 1943. His initial appointment letter placed him in the Supply Corps, as he requested, but his commanding officer, Captain Earl Stone, pictured here, sent a special message to the Chief of Naval Personnel stating, "This individual possesses qualifications and undergone special training for duties stated above, work and communications intelligence group. He is needed to fill a necessary and authorized billet in this group in the advancement of the war effort." The request was approved, and he was transferred from OP-20G on 1 April for officer training at the Washington Navy Yard and then on to Harvard. And this is just an example of, this is his actual officer training book that he was given when he went to the Washington Navy Yard. And this just explains, again, quite vaguely, what a communications intelligence officer does. I mean, when you really read it, you just walk away going, okay, I know nothing more than before I read it. However, before reporting to Harvard for communications intelligence training, Marion took some leave to Ohio to propose to Agnes on April 28, 1943, and she said yes. In the background of the two photos is the St. Mary Roman Catholic Church. Agnes was a lifelong member, and this church and their faith would play a central role in their lives after the war. And I was just, because when I saw that, I was like, well, that's a unique. So I went online, and the church is there still, and the steeple looks exactly as it did in those photos. So I just thought that was very neat. And like I said, it played an integral role in their lives together. This here is a scan of a neat little letter notebook that explains the Naval Training School's mission at Harvard University that Marion sent to his fiancée, Agnes. Now, like I said, these are all marked confidential, but they went into his service record, so you'd never put classified stuff in a military guy's service record. But after his engagement and training at Harvard, Marion returned to Washington, D.C. as an ensign and probably received some additional on-the-job training while working in the Japanese communications cryptanalysis section. Also, he probably played a role in the communication intelligence unit's move from the Navy building on Constitution Ave to their new facility, which was the former Mount Vernon Seminary for girls. The Mount Vernon students left for winter break in December of 1942 and never returned to the campus, or to the Nebraska Avenue campus. The Mount Vernon Seminary campus was pressed into military service for the Navy's effort to decrypt German and Japanese communications. So unlike the Navy Department's building on Constitution Ave, the campus fit the Navy's requirements. It was located away from tall buildings. It settled on high ground so you could intercept things better, and with a clear line of sight to the Pentagon, Fort Meade, and other military installations, and contained a group of buildings, including a dormitory that could be immediately converted for Navy use. And they would use that building, the Navy Security Group, until 2003. Now, Ann told me her father never spoke of what he did while he was in the Navy, but she does remember a family vacation to Washington, D.C. when her and Mark were kids. And she said her and Mark were really excited to see the sights and the monuments, and look, there's the Washington Monument. But her dad kept driving around and going around a particular block. And of course, kids being kids, they weren't too interested in some old building until finally her dad stopped the car and was like, I worked there during the war. And so that's kind of the extent of what they learned from Dad about what happened in World War II and where he worked. So during World War II, personal awards were usually only presented for heroism in combat, or for maybe being wounded or killed in combat. However, units were often recognized by flag officers, or admirals as we called them, via a letter of commendation, which would end up in the personnel record of everyone who was assigned to that unit during the period mentioned. Because of the highly classified nature of the work conducted by the radio intelligence or communication intelligence units, they were quite vague in their praise. However, based on the dates, the one dated October 30th here on the left, this one is probably in reference to the battle in the contributions they provided for the Battle of Midway, which took place between June 4th and 7th, 1942. The second letter is probably for the overall war effort. In the letter, it states how the Vice Chief of Naval Operations visited one day and how he really had a great time and appreciated all the efforts everyone was going through. And it also could be to commend the unit for making the move there, because it's quite a process to move buildings. I mean, you just don't turn off the lights and everyone shows up. It's a process that took many, many months. So this is Marion's first fitness report as a Navy communications officer. It's dated January of 1944, but covered a much earlier period. So someone forgot to give that to him when it was due. But again, because of the nature of the work, not a lot of information is provided in the write-up. It simply states, Ensign Cramer possesses a quiet, pleasant personality, is neat and military in bearing, and gets along well with both officers and men. After being commissioned from an enlisted status, he served quite capably as a junior watch officer in communications intelligence work for almost 6 months before he was transferred to fill a similar billet in Honolulu, Hawaii. He has had over a total of 18 months' experience in communications intelligence work and is believed well qualified to continue in such duty. He should be fitted for promotion when due. E. Stone, Captain, Assistant Director. If I'd ever given one of my bosses a write-up that said that, they would have thrown it back at me. But again, things were so secretive back then. They just said, yeah, he did really good work here. We're not going to tell you what it entailed, though. So like I said, that was his transfer. He was transferring to Hawaii. So he ended up working in both D.C. and Hawaii. He detached in November of 1943, and he received some leave en route to Hawaii, so he was able to visit his family and fiancée Agnes before making his way to Hawaii. He reported to the U.S. Pacific Fleet Radio Unit on 2 January 1944, also known as Station Hypo. So if anyone here has seen either of the Midway movies, the one from 1976, and if you remember Hal Holbrook in the 1976 version, or Brennan Brown in the 2019 version playing Commander Joe Rochefort. That's what Station Hypo was and where he ended up. Holbrook was always walking around in the smoking jacket in the 1976 movie, if you remember that. And Joe Rochefort was just like that. People in the cryptology community tend to be a little eccentric, and Joe Rochefort was eccentric. Now, this was the unit that Marion was assigned to. Unfortunately, he never had the opportunity to work for Joe Rochefort. There's a bit of a sordid tale here. that he may have had some awareness of, since he worked both in Washington, D.C. and Pearl Harbor. All of this occurred while he was, prior to him arriving in Hawaii, but while he was in Washington, D.C. Just months before the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor in the summer of '41, a small collection of intel analysts, linguists, and code breakers would set up the newly renamed Combat Intel Unit in the nondescript basement of Building 1, the administrative headquarters of 14th Naval District. And that is still there to this day. In fact, they don't let you in it, but I actually stood outside that door and saw it. The unit was also known by the codename Station Hypo. Hypo was charged with collection and analysis of Japanese radio signals, by which the United States hoped to keep a wary eye on the expansionist designs of the Japanese Empire. The basement, affectionately known as a dungeon, was described as a large, windowless space crammed with tables full of boxes containing cards and printouts from tabulating machines that could continually spit out messages intercepted from the various receiving stations around the Pacific that the United States had. There was one entrance in and out and guarded at all times by an armed Marine. Hypo was led by brilliant commander Joseph Rochefort, who worked tirelessly with his small staff to keep abreast of Japanese intentions. However, in 1941, American codebreakers were still unable to read the Japanese operational code, known as JN-25, and instead were forced to rely on diplomatic traffic, the inconclusive observations of ship movements, and routine radio correspondence, which was sent in the clear. As a result, we were caught off guard on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked us. However, by March of 1942, some of the JN-25 code had been broken, and Rochefort and his staff were determined to keep close tabs on the Japanese military forces and stay one step ahead of them. From the dungeon, it was determined that the Japanese would launch their next attack on an undisclosed location, simply known through communications as AF. Now, Rochefort reasoned that AF was Midway Island and that the Japanese would attempt invasion around June 4th. However, many in Washington, specifically Commanders Redmond and Joseph Wagner, remained convinced that Japan's next move would be toward the Aleutians or west coast of the United States, leaving Chester Nimitz, the admiral of the Pacific Fleet, with a difficult decision of determining how best to use his limited forces. Remember, we were still recovering from from Pearl Harbor, and none of our battleships were repaired yet. So Station Hypo came up with a brilliant scheme to expose the enemy. A message was sent across the undersea cable instructing U.S. forces on Midway to send a false radio message in the clear stating that Midway's freshwater system had malfunctioned. The Japanese took the bait, and soon Hypo intercepted a Japanese message through the JN-25 system stating that AF was having trouble with its freshwater system. Because of this, Admiral Nimitz favored Rochefort and Layton's analysis and conclusions over D.C. Soon, Nimitz gave orders to send his battleship carriers north of Midway to intercept the Japanese strike force, and a decisive battle was won. As much by the intelligence exploited by these men and women of perceived Japanese intention as by its pilots and crew who sunk four of Japan's fleet carriers. The result was a decisive U.S. victory at the Battle of Midway and the beginning of the end of the Japanese efforts to control the Pacific. However, on October 30th, 1942, after this decisive victory, Commander Rochefort was relieved as the OIC of the Fleet Radio Unit by Captain William Goggins, who was sent from Washington, D.C. by John Redmond. The reason for sidelining Rochefort after Midway had to do with the internal politics of the wider intelligence community and contradicting the opinions of the intelligence officers in Washington who had the ear of the Chief of Naval Operations. Rochefort placed himself on the wrong side of influential figures in the nation's capital, who had conspired against him, had him removed from his intelligence command, and sent him to be the command of a floating dry dock. So Marion did not have the opportunity to work for one of the most brilliant cryptanalysis officers ever. However, he may have still met him because later in 1944, Rochefort was brought back by Nimitz became the head of the Navy's Pacific Strategic Intelligence Section. So he may have been able to work with him to some degree as well. So when Marion arrived in Hawaii in January 1944, he became an assistant watch officer, and then later he would become the watch officer at the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific. It probably resembled something like this in this photo. This is actually a different intercept station site in Hawaii, but it probably resembled something like this. And that's where they would break codes. And that's what his watch team, he would be in charge of the watch team that were intercepting and analyzing these codes. And this is that 5-digit message that they tried to break that I explained. So each of these stood for a word or phrase. But first they had to figure out, they had to decrypt what that 25751 meant. And then after that, they had to figure out what the Japanese term, because it would be in Japanese, and they had to look in the book, figure out what Japanese term turned over into English and what it meant. And a lot of times the way they would do this is, because you learned back then that the first word is always, good day, say. So then they could use these numbers as a way to find other bits of information in this message. And sometimes they could only figure out parts of the message, but they could figure out enough that then what Marion's job would be as a lieutenant is he would call over to the Combat Intelligence Center and say something like, hey, we intercepted this message, and this Japanese ship is going to go over here and do this, or this Japanese battle force is en route over here. And so that's what these guys did in this role. And they did it really well, and obviously they didn't have the computers we have today. Again, here's another one of his fitness reports that he received. Again, they thought very highly of him, but again, very vague in what he actually did. Despite that, he was the vagueness of the reports, he was promoted to Lieutenant JG on May 1st, 1944. And this is the neatest thing, I think, of all, because this was found by Anne in her dad's effects after he had passed. And this was an assignment Lieutenant JG and his men were assigned to while in Hawaii. You can see there, he's the guy in charge, and he had an ensign, and all of these would have been some enlisted men, and they were assigned these different files. And probably what it was old broken codes that they had acquired, and they had to put specifically into these files the way it's stated, so that they had it and so they could use it to go back to and research other codes as they came in. Let me see here. In April 1943, about the time Marion was at the Navy Yard attending officer training, a U.S. Navy intercept site intercepted a JN-25 message on 14 April and sent it to the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific. Through careful analysis, it was determined it provided a detailed itinerary for Admiral Yamamoto. And he was the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack. And he was taking a trip from Rabaul to an air base near Bougainville, and he was scheduled to be at the air base at 7:45 on 18 April. And this newspaper article and a few others were in his effects as well, in Marion's files. So what happened is, after they broke this code, Navy and Marine Corps aircraft were too far away to reach Yamamoto's destination, but a long-range Army Air Corps P-38 Lightning was close enough. And it was dubbed Operation Vengeance, and it headed by Major John W. Mitchell using 18 P-38s from local fighter squadrons. And they took off in the early morning hours of 18 April, flying for 2 hours before arriving at the intercept point. As the Americans arrived on Bougainville coast, so too did Yamamoto's flight, consisting of 2 G-4M Betty bombers with an escort of 60 fighters. The formation was 15 minutes away from landing. The admiral was in the lead plane along with a fleet medical officer and other staff. His chief of staff was in the second plane. Both of them were shot down by the P-38s. Yamamoto and everyone in his plane were killed. However, his chief of staff did survive. Marion this is the type of stuff Marion would do and help in operations that they would help operational commanders perform. Here's a letter of commendation from Admiral Nimitz, dated 15 May 1944 to the Fleet Pacific Radio Unit. Nothing specific again, but by this time, the Japanese had changed their codes again. So Marion and all those guys, it's almost like starting over. Every time they changed their crypto, they had to start over and figure out that 2751 number that we saw probably meant something different this time. So those are the type of things that they would have to start from the beginning on. Just to show that bureaucracy, even in the middle of war, does not stop. The Navy decided to change how they did their fitness reports. And here are two of his from 1945. He was very well regarded and ranked in the top 30 and top 10%. But again, due to the secrecy of his duties, little of substance is offered in these reports to indicate exactly what position or duties he did. The second report is his reporting senior, Captain John S. Harper. And the reason he had two in less than a year is in the Navy, whenever a reporting senior detaches, and this is still true to this day, you've got to do a report on all your officers, even if he just had one. So that's why he had two within a year. Finally, Japan formally surrendered on September 2nd, 1945. U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall had anticipated a significant problem that would arise when the war ended. How do we get all these men home? And he charged the Special Planning Division to figure this out. And so they devised a point system. And initially, you needed 85. Then after Japan surrendered, they dropped it down to 80. Marion only had 43. And the points, it was a convoluted system. If he would have had a child, he'd have gotten 15 points. But because him and Agnes weren't married yet and they didn't have any children, he didn't get as many points. Also, if you were actually in combat, you got extra points. If you had some sort of a Silver Star or combat award, you'd also get points. So the guys who were in Hawaii were not going to get enough points. But he still was promoted to lieutenant, despite not having enough points to go home, which meant some more money for him. The other thing is, typically, a Lieutenant JG has to spend 2 years in that pay grade before he can be promoted, and he was promoted in only a year. So here's some photos of Marion and an unknown officer. We're not sure. At one point, I thought that might be Max Showers, but I don't believe it is. Max Showers is another intel officer who went on to become a Navy admiral. This, I imagine, is his watch team. Even though he didn't have it labeled, I'm fairly certain that was his Hawaii watch team, the guys who he worked with and who actually worked for him while he was on watch. And there over there he is, somewhere in Hawaii. So here are some additional items found in Marion's personal Navy effects. P.Y. Chong was a famous Honolulu restaurateur, and he set up a steakhouse right near outside the base. So a lot of guys ended up there, and because this was in his personal effects, I imagine he and his buddies would go there quite a bit as well. And this is a postcard he also had in his personal effects, signed by P.Y. Chong on VJ Day. And from what Mark just told me, him and Bummy and some of the other guys like to live it up on the weekends. And even though that's not Marion there, he did have quite a few photos of him and the guys having luau's and some fun there when they were in Hawaii and not on watch. And then here's his driver's license. In Hawaii, they require you, even to this day, to have a driver's license when you're in Hawaii. Now, remember a couple hundred slides ago when I showed the Calvertina and told you to remember Bummy? Well, Marion and his high school chum was able to meet up in Hawaii. The exact date is unknown, but definitely before the 1 November because Marion in this photo was still either an ensign or a JG. On May 25th, 1946, Bummy would marry Marion's twin sister, Alice, and so they became brother-in-laws. So not only were they high school buddies, they became brother-in-laws. Oh gosh, what did I just do there? There we go. Here's the full letter that he received, probably as he was detaching, but from Captain Dyer. It pretty much says, hey, you did a great job, but remember, keep the mouth shut when you go home. You can't tell anybody anything. And so obviously that's what he did because we didn't have a good idea. He finally got his orders home. Orders to detach on 16 November. He had detached officially on the 19th of November and reported to the 14th Naval District. Essentially, he walked across the street on the 20th, and then he had to wait for transportation home back to the continental United States. It's not like today when you can just go to the Pearl Airport and hop a flight. And there was a lot of guys going home. So this is how he did it. After almost 4 years, Marion finally got to sea and got his sea legs. He embarked on the USS West Virginia, BB-48, on 23 November 1945, riding her for 8 days and arriving in San Francisco on 30 November, reporting to the 12th Naval District. What's fascinating about this is the West Virginia was a Colorado-class battleship commissioned in 1923 and was at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked with an overwhelming force. And in that raid, the battleship was hit by 2 bombs and at least 7 torpedoes, which blew huge holes in her port side. Skillful damage control saved her from capsizing, but she did quickly sink to the bottom. More than 100 of her crew were lost. Salvaged and given temporary repairs at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard in April 1943, West Virginia steamed to the West Coast for the final repair and modernization at the Puget Sound Navy Yard. It emerged from the shipyard in July of 1944, completely changed in appearance with a wider hull and massively improved anti-aircraft gun battery. She arrived in the Pacific Combat Zone in October and participated in numerous engagements, including the Battle of Surigao Strait on the 24th and 25th of October. This was the last time in world history when battleships engaged battleships with their big guns. On April 1st, 1945, while off Okinawa, the West Virginia was hit by a Japanese kamikaze plane, but was able to remain in action and continue her bombardment duties there into June. After Japan surrendered, the West Virginia supported the occupation effort until mid-September. She participated in Operation Magic Carpet during the last part of 1945, bringing home veterans of the Pacific War. She was inactive in the early 1946, decommissioned in 1947, and sold for scrap in August of 1959. Shortly later, after arriving in San Francisco, Marion hopped on a train and arrived at Great Lakes on 4 December. And what this last one says is, this last paper says, he was, after checking in with the 9th Naval District, he completed his separation physical. The Navy wants to make sure you're healthy before they send you out in the civilian world. He was given civil readjustment processing and sent to Ohio on terminal leave for 63 days. He had built up a lot of vacation time, or we call it leave, and so he was able to go home and still draw a paycheck because of all that earned and accrued leave. His official final day as an active Naval Reserve officer was 7 February 1946. Oh, come on. And this is the book they gave him. It's about 100 pages. It was still with his effects. It's a small little book. Nowadays, sailors get like a week of training on how to transition from the military to civilian life. These poor guys got a day in a small book, and hey, good luck, thanks. I mean, it's really amazing what they had to do. These are some of the other items that were in his effects. This is a separation notice from the Navy. Now it's a DD-214, but the Navy did things a little differently back then. And this is the most important document a service member will ever receive, as it lists all your training, awards, combat duty, rank attained, etc., and is required in order to receive veterans' benefits. In the center is the warning, once again, to everyone not to ask Marion questions about his duties. And then the item on the right were found in his Navy officer records he had with his personal effects. And it does state in some of the handwriting there and then it was typed up down here, that he was a communications watch officer and an assistant watch officer. So that's how we were able to figure out some of what he did. Here's a letter of thanks from the Secretary of the Navy. Here's his certificate of satisfactory service. And then Ann just recently found his post-Navy ID card saying you served. You don't see those around a lot anymore. Like so many men and women who had put their lives on hold to defend freedom, Marion was no different, but he wasted little time upon his return. Just 60 days after returning to Tiffin, Lieutenant Marion Cramer married the love of his life, Agnes Kessler, on January 26, 1946 at St. Mary Catholic Church in Lancaster, Ohio. A few months after his separation and marriage, Marion received the Navy Unit Commendation Award. This award was established by the Secretary of the Navy in 1944 with the approval of the President and is a step below a Presidential Unit Citation. The Navy Unit Commendation is to be awarded to any ship, aircraft, detachment, or other unit in the naval service of the United States which has distinguished itself by outstanding heroism in action against the enemy, but not sufficiently to justify award of Presidential Unit Citation, or to be awarded to any similar unit which has distinguished itself by extremely meritorious service not involving combat, but in support of military operations, and such as to render the unit outstanding compared to similar units. It's essentially equivalent to a personal Silver Star Medal or Legion of Merit, which the communications intelligence units were awarded. And the amazing thing is, this was still, that ribbon, which is in display, was still in his personal effects, and it looked like he had just picked it up from the Navy Exchange. It was in pristine condition. After World War II, we entered the Cold War era. Never again would the U.S. military be drawn down to a skeleton force. The need for intelligence was high, and over the next few years, multiple intelligence agencies, such as the CIA, National Reconnaissance Office, and National Security Agency, would be established. The Navy was developing a professional cryptologic and intelligence organization, both active and reserves. And they were pulling and recruiting their former World War II officer and enlisted sailors who had returned to civilian life. Although he was recruited for both a civilian position and to come on the active drilling reserves, Marion ultimately decided to keep his family in Lancaster and remain at Anchor Hockey. Although he no longer wore the uniform or actively drilled, Marion was still a commissioned officer until 1953. However, he aged out out of his rank, and because of this, he had to resign his commission. That's his resignation, and that's the acceptance letter. And so his honorable discharge, even though he left active duty in 1946, his at his honorable discharge is 19 November 1953. Marion began working for Hocking Glass Corporation in Lancaster, Ohio in 1938, following his graduation from Ohio State. He enlisted in 1942 and then returned to his job, now Anchor Hocking Glass Corporation, in 1946. When he began, he was in the insurance section, but a series of promotions sent him to the retirement pension section, where he worked for the remainder of his time. He would walk the 6 to 7 blocks to the headquarters in downtown Lancaster. Sometimes he would stop at the Kresge's across the street for breakfast with Malcolm Forbes and Cy Fulton. He retired in 1979 at the age of 65 after 41 years with the company. Although I never met Marion, I feel I've gotten to know him through these files Mark and Ann have shared and the many emails and conversations with Ann. I think it's safe to say that he would tell us that what he did during the war wasn't nearly as important as what he did following the war. Marion Agnes and raising Ann and Mark with her. On July 2nd, 1954, the couple adopted Ann from St. Anne's Hospital in Columbus through Catholic Social Services. 2 years later, on October 22nd, 1956, they welcomed Mark to the family. The reason for the 2-year wait was because Catholic Social Services policy was to wait 2 years after the first adoption to see how things worked out. Ann and Mark were raised with the knowledge they were adopted and proud of it. Ann told me, "We have always celebrated the dates as anniversaries, and Mom and Dad always remembered them with either cards or well wishes." Now, this is completely unrelated to the overall story of Marion per se, but I find it fascinating because they do say twins run in family, and by God, it does. Look at this. If the computer will, there we go. Talk about a family of twins. So there's Marion and Mary Alice. Here's Jean and Janet Cramer. Their parents were Fred and Ruth Cramer. Fred was Marion and, right? Did I get that right? Yeah. And then Jack and Jean Distel, their parents were Jean and Clara Louise, which were Marion and Mary Alice's younger sister. And then down here in the bottom are Lynna and Lee Baumgartner, Bummy and Mary Alice's twins. I mean, wow. Kind of scary to have kids in that family. So this photo is Marion in his later years with his dog, Tiffin. When he rescued this dog, his name was Fremont, but being a Tiffin boy, he quickly corrected his new dog's name to his childhood home's namesake. And then this beautiful photo is Agnes and Marion later in life, still a beautiful and loving couple. Marion passed away at the age of 90 on September 13th, 2004, taking the secrets entrusted to him by the United States Navy with him. His lovely wife, Agnes, at the age of 95, joined him March 28th, 2015. Marion left quite a legacy. A member of the greatest generation, when the world was at its bleakest moment, he answered his country's call, serving through 3.5 dark years of World War II that ensured victory and freedom for so many. And when his service was done, the Navy told him not to speak of what he did, so he quietly returned to civilian life without telling a soul. He was a yeoman with intelligence designation. A few years later, they would be known as Yeoman 2505 Intel clerks. In 1975, those specific yeomen and personnel in the Photographic Intelligenceman rating, which was established in 1957, would merge to become the Intelligence Specialist rating, which was what I was for my 24 years. He was also a pioneer in the communications intelligence field as a commissioned officer, which would later become cryptologic officers in the 1950s. Today, they are now known as information warfare officers. And most importantly, Ann and Mark. Thank you both for sharing your dad's story with me and allowing me to share it with you today. Thank you. And if you'd like some more information,